You're standing at the gates of an ancient city, 325 AD, and in about 48 hours, one man is going to make a decision, not on a battlefield, in a room. That decision will determine what 2 billion people on Earth believe about God, about Jesus, about salvation itself. This man has never read a gospel. He still worships the sun, and he's about to author Christianity. His name is Constantine, and if he gets this wrong, the consequences won't just be theological, they'll be eternal for billions of souls. Here's the question that set all of this in motion. A single question so dangerous, people were being killed over it in the streets. Is Jesus God, or is he a man sent by God? These weren't just theological debates. They were tearing the Roman Empire in half. Constantine had a problem. A fractured religion means a fractured empire. So he called 300 bishops into a room, told them, "You're not leaving until there's one answer." Now, here's what most people assume happened next. The scholars debated. The wisest voices prevailed. The truth won out. Wrong. The side that had the most historical, logical, scriptural support lost. His name was Arius, a priest from Alexandria, Egypt. His argument was simple. God is one. Jesus was sent by God. They are not the same being. This wasn't a fringe view. Millions of Christians held it. Across Egypt, Syria, Palestine, it was the dominant position in many regions, and Constantine destroyed it. Arius's writings were burned, his followers exiled. Owning his texts became a crime punishable by death. The losing side was erased from history, which would have been devastating enough on its own, except the winning side didn't just triumph through logic, they triumphed through something else entirely. Constantine wasn't a theologian, he was a general, and he treated this debate the way generals treat battlefield disputes, with force. He didn't care which side was scripturally accurate, he cared which side would unify his empire. The Trinitarian position, Jesus as divine, equal to God, offered something the Arian view didn't: a cosmic drama, a God who descends, suffers, dies, rises. It was mythologically satisfying. It mirrored the dying and rising god stories that saturated the Roman world: Osiris, Mithras, Dionysus. It was familiar, and familiarity sells better than precision. So Constantine backed it, not because it was true, because it was useful. But here's the part that makes the whole story collapse. The theology Constantine enforced at Nicaea, it didn't come from the people who actually knew Jesus. Let's go back. 1st century Palestine. A man is walking from village to village, teaching, and when someone asks him the most important commandment of all, he doesn't hesitate. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." That's Mark 12:29. The greatest commandment. In Jesus' own words, God is one. He prays to God. He calls God the only true God. The word Trinity never leaves his lips, not once, not in any gospel. That's the original message. So how did we get from God is one to God is three persons in one essence? Here's the gap that breaks everything. Jesus finishes his ministry around 30 AD. Roughly 5 years later, a man named Paul of Tarsus appears. He never sat with Jesus, never heard him preach, never broke bread with the disciples. By his own account, he spent those years persecuting the followers of Jesus. Then he claims a vision on the road to Damascus, and from that vision alone, with no witnesses, no disciples to verify it, he begins teaching something Jesus never said: that Jesus was divine, that Jesus was one with God, that Jesus existed before creation. 5 years. That's the gap between Jesus preaching God is one and Paul introducing a theology that would eventually become the Trinity. Not decades, not centuries. 5 years. The disciples, the people who actually walked with Jesus, never taught his divinity. Peter didn't, James didn't, John the Baptist didn't, but Paul, who never met him, did. And 300 years later, Constantine made Paul's vision the official doctrine of the Christian world. Which raises a question you can't ignore. If the theology enforced at Nicaea came from a man who never knew Jesus, and the people who did know Jesus taught something different, what happened to the original message? You'd expect it to be lost, buried under centuries of imperial decrees and burning manuscripts. Some of it was, but here's what you wouldn't expect. The most dramatic collision between the two versions of Jesus didn't happen in Rome. It happened in the Arabian desert, 300 years after Nicaea. A delegation of Christian scholars from the city of Najran, men who had dedicated their lives to defending the Nicene Creed, traveled to Medina to challenge a man named Muhammad. The Quran had been revealed, and it said Jesus was the Messiah, born of a virgin, a great prophet, but not divine, not part of a trinity. These scholars were experts. They knew their theology, they knew their history, and they were convinced Muhammad was wrong. So the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, offered a challenge, a mubahala, a mutual invocation. Each side would bring their families, their loved ones, and call upon God to curse the liars, to destroy the side that was teaching falsehood. The scholars considered it. Then they refused. Not because they were cowards, because they weren't certain he was wrong. And that's when the entire story snaps into focus. Islam didn't arrive as something new. It arrived as something restored. The strict monotheism Jesus himself preached, the Lord our God is one Lord, was never abolished by God. It was abolished by men, by councils, by emperors, by political necessity. And when the Quran came 600 years later, it didn't contradict Jesus. It contradicted Nicaea. The real question was never Muhammad versus Jesus. It was always Jesus versus Constantine, the prophet versus the emperor who never read his words. Let's be precise about what we know, not as Islamic claims, as documented history. The word Trinity, never spoken by Jesus, never appears in the Bible. The Trinity as a formal doctrine, first articulated 150 years after Jesus died by church fathers, not apostles. Nicaea, called by a Roman emperor who worshipped the Son for political unity, not theological truth. The Arian position, which echoes Jesus's own recorded words, declared heresy, burned, erased. These are not interpretations. These are the facts. So the question isn't whether the manipulation happened, it's whether what survived the fire was the original. Jesus said, "The Lord our God is one Lord." He called it the greatest commandment of all. 300 years later, a council voted against it. And today, 2 billion people follow what that council decided, not what Jesus taught. The tragedy isn't that people disagree about Jesus. The tragedy is that most people have never heard what he actually said. Before the councils, before the creeds, before the empire transformed a prophet's message into a religion he wouldn't recognize.